Hi there, I'm June Hogan. I'm a career coach and founder of outplacement services provider Wildwood Coaching. This is a recording of a monthly lunch and learn session, which my colleague Robin and I run each month, diving into a topic relating to redundancy. This month, we explored voluntary redundancy, what it means in practice, how you can approach it, and how to support people through it in a thoughtful and constructive way. If you find this useful and you'd like to join future sessions live where you can ask your questions and join in the discussion, you'll find details in the description, or you can subscribe to the channel for updates. So I hope you find the session helpful and interesting. And if you want to make any comments or reach out for questions, Robin and I would be happy to hear from you. So we're going to talk about voluntary redundancy. This might be your first time managing a program. We'll welcome any question that is related to voluntary redundancy or indeed redundancy. So I've just got a few introductory pieces on here that Robin will talk through. And I think the really important one on there, that it's still a dismissal, so a process kind of needs to be followed.
In terms of ACAS guidelines, we'll always say you should try and mitigate against compulsory redundancy, and voluntary redundancy is a way of doing that. Now, of course, there's lots of things you should be looking at before you get to is redundancy required, be it compulsory or voluntary? Is it a headcount freeze? Is it a restructuring cost exercise, etc., etc.? But in terms of VR, it's something that can be used. It doesn't have to be, and it will depend on the circumstances in any one organization. It's something that can be used when you ask, especially when there's a selection process, and rather than going through that, what can be a quite painful process, then you may want to ask the volunteers before you go through you are selected because you scored the worst in any of that kind of selection process. So it does make it, I believe, for individuals, easier for them to kind of stick their hand up and volunteer rather than being told you are below the line and therefore you are being selected for redundancy. So I think from a well-being perspective, it can be easier. I'm not saying that there's no impact to individuals, because there certainly is. It doesn't matter if it's voluntary or compulsory redundancy, it still has an impact on individuals. In my experience, it tends to be an easier pathway for people to volunteer. In terms of the redundancy package, it typically includes an enhanced redundancy incentive. So you will still have the absolute minimum of statutory calculation. However, what's the incentive for people to step forward? And we will come on to that later on in the presentation. As June said, it is still the redundancy dismissal. So if you're making more than 20 people redundant, you've still got to abide by the collective consultation guidelines and make sure that any dismissal, especially in the collective scenario, is after the 30 days of when you've started the collective consultation. You can slightly get around that by using settlement agreements and the like, but in terms of just be mindful of when you're planning the voluntary redundancy scheme, how you are going to operate it, what the incentives are, what the timescales are before you move forward.
Yeah, that's a really important point there, Robin, in terms of, it still needs to be included in the numbers, which is, super important. Okay. Thinking about when you would consider using VR and when you might not consider it. So we're just going to kind of come at both angles there. And we've got some points there around the fact that, you might want to reduce headcount with, as you say, Robin, with sort of minimum disruption. There might be people who, you might get a sense that the people might be sort of willing or prepared to volunteer. Helps to avoid the compulsory redundancy. So talk to us about when it's a good idea, I guess, to introduce it.
I think definitely when there is a selection and scoring process, I think it does ease the pain of going through a redundancy process. Also, from a employer's perspective, you may want to consider it if timescales are very tight, because the HR resources that go into a large-scale redundancy process can be quite onerous in terms of time and resource. And by doing a voluntary redundancy process, you can bypass slightly individual consultation process. So you can reduce the time and resource required to do individual consultation, because someone's kind of saying, I don't need any consultation. So I think that time pressures is something to consider. And also when there's definitely a selection process going on board. The other is to mitigate against any potential legal risk. So if the company have not followed every element of the redundancy process, it may be a way to reduce risk by offering VR, but via a settlement agreement. So just think about, has your organization done absolutely everything that it should have done before going down that? Now, hopefully, the answer is you're not using it for that particular reason because you have followed due process. But those are, from an employer's perspective, elements to think about minimizing the legal risk and come back on the process, as it were.
And I always find it interesting that one of them was saying, well, I knew I wouldn't be, I would be at the bottom of the line, as you were saying earlier. So I knew that there were people who would get the jobs ahead of me, or there was one individual said there were two of us in the running, and that individual, I'm at a different stage in my career, different stage in my life. I just felt like, didn't want to put us both through that process. There can be lots of different reasons why people would volunteer, that it's the right time for them. Maybe they already found the job and just haven't told you, well, good luck to them. There's lots of different reasons. And I think it's just about giving people the option, I guess, as you say, Robin, is that it's there as an option. You might not get any volunteers, but you put it out there. Previously, when I was managing redundancies, I would assume that if someone volunteered, well, that's because you've got it all sorted. You're going to volunteer and off you go, and you've got everything kind of lined up for when you leave. And it isn't like that. People that volunteer for a number of different reasons. So yeah, just interesting from my perspective when I hear people kind of on the other side. So yeah, I think it's a balance, as you say. But then there's also, when is it not appropriate to offer VR? So we've just got a few points here just to talk through. And I think there's that one there about the risk of losing high performance. We'll come on to that in terms of the process and how VR kind of works. When you say, actually, no, I don't think it's appropriate to offer it in this situation.
I mean, I'll go back 25 plus years. It's my first ever redundancy process. I was on a sandwich placement from uni, and we were required to reduce headcount by 50 people in quite a large organisation. We sent out, would anybody like to volunteer? And for those 50 places, we had 500 people applying. And a number of those individuals were applying because it was in the public sector, and it was quite generous in terms of the payments, especially on the pension side of things. In hindsight, we probably should have targeted who we wanted to volunteer. So rather than going to the whole workforce, it would have been much more appropriate to go to the areas of the business that wanted to reduce headcount rather than just opening it up. So I think where you want to retain people and not let them go, don't open it too wide. If you need to kind of set your sights on, actually, if people do volunteer, is there a realistic mechanism for them to actually leave the business? Whereas if you've got people who are saying, yes, but I really want to go, and it's kind of like, yes, but we actually need your skills and your area, we're not making any reductions, then it's not good for the employee and it's not good for the employer. So make sure you focus on where you actually need those reductions to take place.
Yeah, I've seen that work in organisations where they'll have a VR campaign, and literally there will be functions that say you're not eligible, critical skills, you're not eligible to apply. And that's perfectly acceptable. People can complain all they like, but if you need to protect those critical skills, then that's your kind of ability to do that, isn't it?
Yeah, and also when you do a VR process, sometimes it does come down to cost. So I can remember working for a very large global organization, and the cost of one individual to go was £600,000 for him to leave, when actually they were probably on a salary of less than 150k with only 1 or 2 years until they'd already kind of said, I will be retiring at this age. It really doesn't make sense to accept you volunteering for redundancy. It was cheaper for the business to keep that individual on and select someone else. So you can select it on cost parameters, but it's to make sure that if people are on different types of redundancy packages, because in very large organizations, you may have had people who tupe it in from lots of different places and be on different redundancy terms. So you just need to be really quite careful on how you manage that.
And just a comment there in the chat about NHS colleagues who've been offered outplacement too early in the process, not back for VR. Yeah, those critical skills should be identified at the outset rather than creating a further bad feeling. So yeah, thank you. It's a tricky one, isn't it? As you say, you've got to not just jump into it because you think VR is a good thing to do, but to really understand the landscape of what you're looking to, how you're looking to propose it and the potential impact on individuals. Because I do think there is that notion of, if VR is available, then well, surely I'll get it. I've applied, therefore, and you want people to leave. So the message to me as an individual says, well, you'll have to let me go then, won't you? Because you need to reduce headcount by X.
And it can cause a lot of disruption within, especially for our individual, if they're kind of putting their hand up saying, I want to go, and you turn around and say, oh no, you're really valued and we're not going to accept. But there's probably some rationale why that person has stuck their hand up in the first place. So you will have to manage that individual on an ongoing basis. The more you can focus it, the better. But you do retain the ability to either accept or reject ventures for a voluntary redundancy.
Some of the advantages and disadvantages then, well, we've covered some of these, but just to kind of summarise. So we talked a little bit about reduces the need for compulsory redundancy. As you said, Robin, mitigates against risk to a certain extent, can be seen as fairer to support your employer brand. And those people who volunteered maybe feel a bit more in control, as you say, rather than being made redundant, as it were, volunteering. But we talked there about the risk of losing key talent. You don't know who's going to apply. Clearly, that's a variable, and that cost there of those enhanced packages. And we've got some ideas as to what enhancements might look like. And of course, you may still need to go into a compulsory process afterwards, depending on the nature of the program that you're doing. And I guess it can lengthen the process somewhat. I mean, not hugely, because you're going to make sure it's time bound, aren't you, in terms of when people have to apply, etc.
I'm probably just picking up on the element about the timing in terms of when is it appropriate to announce a voluntary redundancy process. Well, it does depend if it's based on individual consultation, i.e. less than 20, or if it's going to be more than 20. If it's going to be more than 20, then obviously one of the things you're going to have to consult on collectively is a voluntary redundancy and what the package is likely to be. Now, it could be that the organisation has no enhancement, but that's quite unusual. There normally is some kind of enhancement. So in terms of an expression of interest, when is a window open and when is a window closed? And then once you, as employer, receive that expression of interest, you need to make a decision, are we going to give them an offer or not? And then you obviously write to the individual with all the details, be it with assessment agreement or not. And then the employee then accepts the offer. And then that is a contract. And once both parties, once you've done the offer and they've done the acceptance, then it's pretty much binding in terms of the enhancement, the data termination. And to change it, you can only really change it by mutual consent. Whereas with a normal redundancy process, you can technically pull the redundancy and say, congratulations, we've gone through this whole process, but things have changed. You are no longer redundant. You wouldn't be able to do that if the voluntary redundancy has been accepted. Once it's done, it's kind of binding. So that is one of the disadvantages of just a word of warning.
Okay, fantastic. So you talked there about how to implement VR. So we'll just run through that, and then we'll come on to some of those common sort of enhancements, and then we can see if there are any questions as a result of. So, as Robin said at the start there, is you're going to have to approach this like you would any other redundancy process. So defining the business case, etc. looking at the pool, and then designing the package, what that might look like. And then the communication, making sure it's time bound, assessing who applies and kind of what criteria, I guess, you're going to use for that. And then going through the motions of confirming the decisions, settlement agreements where you might need to use them, and offering out placement support. So, Robin, just go into a bit more detail about that then, so how you would go through the process. And I think one of the things for me is, you mentioned at the start, well, when would you introduce this? And I guess it depends on whether it's collective or if you're going through individual, if you've got less than 20. But so when would you, I guess you've got to have it on the table at the start when you're doing your planning. You've got to have it because you've got to have agreed the package, and then take that to collective if you're in collective consultation. But just sort of the timing, if you like, in terms of when you would introduce VR.
Yeah, so in my experience, it definitely helps to get it out there sooner rather than later. So if it's on the collective side of the equation or scenario, then I tend to go in on the first consultation meeting with we're proposing to mitigate against compulsory redundancies those people who wish to express an interest in voluntary redundancy, and this is a package that we are contemplating. Some organisations will have a redundancy policy which kind of outlines what their voluntary redundancy entails. Most don't. So it's to launch that to the employee reps or trade union, to say what you're proposing, and to get agreement with that as soon as you possibly can. So then you can start with, okay, this is when the window will open, and you can start the process directly with employees. But every case will be slightly different. In terms of, and I know we're going to come on to it, but it's the what level do you set that VR package at, and how do you do that? I think what's important is you need to be consistent with whatever package you're providing. There are some lovely tax regulations which I'm not sure even HRC would kind of use that often, but it should be signed off by or at least being shown to be considered during collective consultation, because that then potentially can make it tax-free, especially if it's below the 30k level, including the statutory redundancy payment as well. So as long as everything is below the 30, okay, it can be tax-free. If you start kind of saying, well, for this person, we're going to give X, and for that person, we're going to give Y, and we're going to make it up as we go along, then technically that voluntary redundancy payment could become taxable. And especially if it hasn't gone through that collective consultation process. So there's a hint and tip for you that make sure that I always try and get out early. I try and get it agreed by the latest at the second consultation meeting. So I propose it at the first, and then at the second meeting, which is typically a week or 10 days later, and then to come back for any further considerations, but to get it agreed at the starting process rather than at the end.
And how would that impact? You mentioned there about obviously having it documented that it's been agreed for tax purposes. What if you're doing less than 20? Does that still apply in terms of having a record of the fact that it has been agreed, not agreed with those who are impacted, but agreed as a kind of a structured way of approaching this, as opposed to giving Bob this and giving Sue that? And
have you documented letters, or you may have gone through a slide presentation with the individual. So it is to make sure that it is documented somewhere. That's your proposal, and that's how you're going to do it. Now, in terms of will you consider any representations on an increased package or it done differently? Yeah, absolutely. But at the end of the day, you don't have to agree. You just need to consider those various consultation, be it collective or individual.
And we got that point there about the communication. So clearly making it being straightforward about you're not guaranteed to be accepted. So there's going to be a letter that goes with that, email, whatever. And I guess it depends on the scale, but what would be a reasonable time frame that you would give people to apply?
It's a good question, Julian. It depends on how big and how complicated the organisation and restructuring program is. If it's something that's reasonably simplistic, you're not going to be doing a night shift anymore, and therefore you're offering suitable alternative employment to the night shift workers, become day shift workers, and there's let's say 10 of them, then it could be, let us know in the next 48 hours if you would like to be considered. You know, is moving you to a day shift super alternative employment. It depends on the premiums that you've been paying for night shift. I know a 30% uplift, and well, it's going to be a 30% reduction. In that case, it wasn't, or we deemed it not to. So we gave them the option of, you can either take this, i.e. a day shift, or if you want voluntary redundancy, you can do. And that happened rather quickly. In other cases, when, you've got maybe hundreds or, tens of hundreds, then you might want to open it up for a week, 10 days, just for the expression of interest. Obviously, the paperwork then follows. You need to think about, in your timing plan, the resource you're going to need to do those offers and the paperwork. And if you're doing settlement agreements, the admin process of doing that will depend on what resource you got to do it. So the whole process can take anything from a week all the way through to being 3 or 4 weeks. But you want to get it sorted, not just from the employee's perspective, but actually more importantly, the employee's perspective. If they put their hand up and they really want to go, all they want to do is get the paper, sign it, and confirm that they will be redundant on XYZ date with XYZ package.
Yeah, absolutely. And depending on the scale of the process, you've then got other people kind of holding their breath, wondering whether enough people have volunteered and all of that. So I think it's a good point you make there up front around being able to deliver on that timeline from a HR perspective and having people lined up to assess the applications, review them, give the feedback, move forward with rejections, acceptances. So yeah, I think that's really important, that you don't set unrealistic expectations with people in that process, because it's a big deal to put your head above the parapet and say, I'd like to go. So yeah, I think that's really useful just to dig into some of that and again, build that into the timing plan. Okay, cool. So we'll just go on then just to finish up with some enhancements. So a lot of this is going to depend on budget, obviously, as you said, if the company's got a redundancy policy. So yeah, talk us through some of these and Robin, or ones that you've seen as typical. And I guess it does depend, doesn't it, on in different organizations.
There's a huge range. I've done various scenario planning for clients where they don't have the redundancy policy. It is so wide and open. It will depend on the finances of that organization. They afford to be really generous. A big multinational, they might be a little bit more generous. If they are a small organization and there's huge cost pressures on them, they might not have a budget to do some of these things. So you need to review. I can remember for one quite large organization doing, I think, over 26 different scenarios of what the cost impact would be. And, be it on multipliers of the statutory calculation is quite common. And just 1.25, 1.5 and 2, but it could be, it could be anything. Another common methodology which is used quite commonly is to remove a weekly cap. It tends to benefit the more higher paid individuals. So it depends on your organization. If they're all managers who are earning over £751, as it is at the moment, then removing that cap can be quite a good way to increase that incentive. If you've got a workforce who earning below 751, it's going to make no difference at all. You may have a spread of employees from your production line all the way up to your managing director. By removing the cap, the senior manager will do quite well, but actually the person on the shop floor will have no impact. The other one is to count part years of service. It's not my favourite, to be honest. So obviously with your statutory redundancy calculations, it's based on full complete years of service. So this kind of says, well, if they've got 3 years and 8 months, we will calculate it as if they've got 4 years. I think it sometimes causes more issues than it resolves. But as long as you've got all your data, you'll be able to, from an employer's perspective, see what the impact is per individual. The other is to guarantee a minimum payment. It can be 8 weeks or 12 weeks. It does have an impact on especially those with less than 2 years service. So quite commonly, when I do redundancy programs, I always think it's really harsh on those people who have got 1 year and 6 months service. I always try and suggest to clients that actually we make it as if the minimum payment is based on if they had 2 years service. So at least everybody gets something in the process. But yeah, there's literally 101 different ways planning out what you could do as an enhancement. What's important is thinking about what sector you're operating in and what other organizations perhaps have done, or what's common practice within your area or industry area, because individuals will know somebody who has got XYZ, and they're thinking, well, why aren't I getting that enhancement? You do need to cost it out properly, like you would any redundancy program, but you've got to make it something worthwhile for the individual to volunteer. If the incentive is £100, what's in it for me? Not a lot. If it's 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, whatever it is, then actually that's a little bit more of an incentive to put your hand up, as it were. So it needs to be realistic. Don't go in too low, and vice versa, don't go in too high.
Mm.
Every organization will need to review what can they realistically afford.
Yeah, and you mentioned there, Robin, about the impact on people if you're doing something across an organization, from entry-level roles up to senior managers. I worked with an organization and they just offered a lump sum, and it was the same for everyone. So they offered everyone £3,000 because they recognised the impact of doing it. So some of those things there in terms of the multiplier, or removing I think they already had actual weekly pay, but they wanted it to be fair and reasonable. So the person on the production line got the same as a senior manager. So yeah, I guess you can get creative, but the real opportunity is, can you afford it in the first place? And also, it's got to be more than here's £100, because it's going to save us a load of hassle. And also building in the cost of settlement agreements into that as well. I think we mentioned that before, didn't we, in terms of adding those in.
And also think through what's the cost of HR and management time to do the individual consultation process. If you think it's going to be at least a minimum of 2 meetings, it's probably going to be 2 hours. So you've already got 4 hours of kind of management time. There's a cost to that. As a minimum, you should be passing that saving, let's call it, if they're not going to go for individual consultation, that money that you've saved on not doing it. There are those kind of elements. Also, the reduction in liability, it doesn't totally disappear, but it is highly reduced. But there's a value to that to organizations as well. So I think there is a minimum, £1,000. It is what I would always kind of be looking for clients to kind of think through. If you're doing a VR process, that's kind of at the bottom end of what you should be offering. But it does depend on, if you are in such financial constraints, then it may be less. But I think that's your minimum starting point. In other organizations, I've seen it starting at the minimum is £10,000.
Mm.
But that tends to be employees who are already paid quite high, and it needs to be an incentive for them to put their hands up.
Absolutely. And it goes back to the point at the start that VR might not be appropriate. So if you literally can do nothing more than statutory, then there's no point doing a VR process. So yeah, going back to the basics. So we're just going to do a couple of slides to finish, and then we'll invite any questions. So if you are entering into a redundancy process and you need some specialist consultative advice, is what I'm trying to say, then Robin is available. Find him on LinkedIn. He's easy to find on LinkedIn. Then I've got a podcast, Redundancy Matters, where I interview people and do solo episodes all about putting people at the heart of a redundancy process. There's blogs on my website, and of course we do these every month as well. And outplacement support is something which I work with organisations to offer. And if you want to join us next time, we are here again on the 19th of May, and we're talking all things redundancy FAQs. You can send your questions in, and because we're going to be recording it, then we can answer the question in the session, or you can come along. So I'm going to end the session for the purposes of the recording, and then we can see if there are any questions.